In the rolling countryside
In the
of South
rolling
Carolina,
countryside
there
of
stood a
South Carolina,
plantation that held a
there
secret
stood-
so peculiar, so deliberate, that it would baffle historians for generations. For 4 decades, a single bed in the eastern wing remained untouched. Never slept in, never made, never acknowledged by anyone who lived within those walls. The family that owned the property went to extraordinary lengths to keep this room hidden from visitors, from servants, from anyone who might ask questions. But what they didn't know was that their silence would eventually speak louder than any confession ever could. Before we continue with the story of the Harrington family and their inexplicable obsession with an empty room, if you're new to Liturgy of Fear, please subscribe and let us know in the comments where you're listening from today. This is a story that will make you question everything you thought you knew about the families that shaped American history. The Harrington Plantation sprawled across nearly 800 acres of prime agricultural land in Beaufort County, South Carolina. The main house, built in 1789, was a testament to the prosperity that slavery had afforded the family. A 3-story federal-style mansion with white columns that caught the afternoon light like teeth in a smile. The grounds were meticulously maintained. Gardens arranged in geometric precision, slave quarters arranged in neat rows at a distance that made them invisible from the main house, and a network of outbuildings that served every function a self-sufficient estate required. The family itself was unremarkable in most respects. Thomas Harrington had inherited the plantation from his father in 1801 when he was just 23 years old. He was a man of moderate temperament, known in the county for his fair dealings with merchants and his participation in the local militia. His wife, Eleanor, came from a family of equal standing, the Carpenters, whose own plantation lay 30 miles to the north. They had married in 1802, a union that was less about passion and more about the consolidation of land and influence. By 1810,
If a guest required lodging, they were directed to one of the rooms in the main part of the house or to the guest cottage that stood near the entrance to the property. The servants who cleaned the eastern wing were instructed to do so only when the family was away, and they were told never to speak of what they found there. What they found in those rare moments when they were permitted to enter the room was a room that appeared frozen in time. The bed was made with sheets that had never been slept upon. The wardrobe contained clothing that had never been worn. The writing desk held no papers, no letters, no evidence of any human activity whatsoever. It was as if the room existed in a state of perpetual readiness for someone who would never arrive. Eleanor Harrington was the keeper of this secret. It was she who gave the orders about the room. She who ensured that the servants understood the absolute necessity of their silence, and she who, on the rare occasions when someone asked about the eastern wing, would smile tightly and change the subject with the practiced ease of someone who had been doing so for years. The other members of the family, Thomas, William, Catherine, and James, seemed to accept the existence of the forbidden room without question. They did not enter it, they did not speak of it, they did not acknowledge it in any way that might suggest it held significance. And yet, the room remained, year after year, a silent presence in the house, like a held breath that never quite escaped. The explanation for the room's existence when it finally emerged came not from the Harringtons themselves, but from a letter that arrived in the spring of 1811. The letter was addressed to Thomas Harrington, and it came from a town in Virginia that few people in South Carolina had heard of. The handwriting was careful, educated, and bore the marks of someone who had taken great pains to compose the message with precision. Thomas read the letter in his study, and when he emerged, his face had taken on a peculiar expression, something between resignation and dread. He called Eleanor into the room and closed the door. The servants heard raised voices, though not the words themselves. When Eleanor emerged an hour later, her composure was intact, but her eyes suggested that something fundamental had shifted. Within a month, her carriage arrived at the Harrington plantation bearing a young woman. She was perhaps 20 years old, with dark hair and features that bore an unmistakable resemblance to Thomas Harrington. Her name was Margaret, and she was, as Thomas would later explain to Eleanor in a conversation that the servants pieced together from fragments overheard through walls and doorways, his daughter. The existence of Margaret was not entirely a shock to Eleanor. Thomas had, before their marriage, lived a life that was not entirely without incident. There had been a woman in Charleston, a woman of mixed race, who had borne him a child. Thomas had made arrangements for the child's care, financial arrangements, the kind that were not uncommon among men of his station. The woman had died when Margaret was an infant, and the child had been raised by relatives in Virginia, far from South Carolina, and far from the life that Thomas had built with Eleanor. But now Margaret had come to the plantation, and she could not simply be sent away. She was, after all, Thomas's daughter, and there were certain obligations that even a man as careful about his reputation as Thomas Harrington could not entirely ignore. Yet she could not be acknowledged as a member of the family, not in a society where her mixed heritage would make her an impossible embarrassment, not in a household where Eleanor's position as the legitimate wife and mother of legitimate children had to be maintained without question. The solution was the room in the Eastern Wing. Margaret was installed in that room, and she was given a life that was neither that of a family member nor that of a servant. She was not permitted to eat with the family. She was not permitted to appear in the public rooms of the house. She was not permitted to attend church or to be seen in the town. She was, for all practical purposes, a ghost, present in the house but invisible to the world beyond it. The servants were instructed that Margaret was a distant relative who came to stay temporarily, that she was in delicate health and required quiet and solitude, and that any discussion of her presence in the house would result in severe punishment. Some of the servants understood the truth immediately. Others constructed their own explanations, stories that were perhaps less accurate but no less damaging to Margaret's dignity. Margaret herself accepted her confinement with a resignation that suggested she had expected nothing better. She had been raised in poverty and obscurity, and the Harrington plantation, for all its restrictions, offered her a level of material comfort that she had never known. She had a room of her own, she had adequate food, she had books which she read voraciously, and a writing desk which she used to compose letters that were never sent. The 1810s passed, and Margaret remained in her room. She was 21, then 25, then 30. The world beyond the plantation changed. The War of 1812 came and went. The cotton gin transformed the economy of the South. The enslaved population of the Harrington plantation grew as Thomas invested more heavily in the cultivation of cotton. The family's wealth increased, and with it, their social standing in the county. Eleanor bore Thomas 2 more children, a daughter named Susan in 1812 and a son named Robert in 1815. These children grew up in a household where the Eastern Wing was simply not discussed, where visitors were never shown that part of the house, where the servants had learned to move through the corridors as if that entire section of the building did not exist. Margaret watched her half-siblings grow from the windows of her room. She saw William become a young man, saw him ride out on horseback in the mornings, saw him return in the evenings with the confidence of someone who belonged entirely to the world that had been denied to her. She saw Catherine blossom into a young woman, saw her dressed in the finest fabrics, saw her attended by servants who brought her tea and helped her into her gowns. She saw James and Susan and Robert grow and change, and she remained always in her room. The room itself became a kind of prison, but it was a prison of a particular sort. Margaret was not locked in. The door to her room had no lock on the outside. She was free to leave whenever she wished, but to leave would be to expose herself to the world, to invite the questions that would inevitably follow, to risk the anger of Thomas and Eleanor, and to lose the only security she had ever known. So she remained. The servants who brought her meals, and there were always servants assigned to this task, servants who were rotated regularly so that no one person would become too familiar with her, reported that she was quiet, that she did not complain, that she seemed to accept her situation with a kind of stoic resignation. Some of them felt pity for her. Others felt nothing at all. A few perhaps felt a kind of contempt, as if her confinement was somehow a reflection of her own inadequacy, rather than a deliberate choice made by the family that brought her to the plantation. Thomas Harrington, for his part, seemed to have largely forgotten about Margaret. He did not visit her room, he did not inquire about her welfare, he did not acknowledge her existence in any way that might suggest she held any claim on his attention or his affection. It was as if the room existed in a state of perpetual readiness for someone who would never arrive. It was as if by refusing to acknowledge her, he could convince himself that she did not exist, that the decision he had made to bring her to the plantation and confine her to a single room was not a decision at all, but simply the natural order of things. Eleanor, by contrast, seemed to take a grim satisfaction in Margaret's confinement. She ensured that the rules governing her isolation were strictly enforced. She was the one who decided what Margaret would eat, what books she would be permitted to read, what supplies she would be allowed. She was the one who, on the rare occasions when Margaret's presence threatened to become visible, when a servant spoke too freely, when a visitor came too close to the eastern wing, took swift and decisive action.
In the spring of 1825, something happened that nearly exposed the secret of Margaret's existence. A traveling physician came to the plantation to attend to Eleanor, who had fallen ill with a fever. The physician was a man named Dr. Nathaniel Prescott, a man of some education and considerable curiosity. He had been trained in Philadelphia and had traveled extensively throughout the South, and he had developed a reputation for asking questions that went beyond the purely medical. Dr. Prescott spent 3 days at the plantation, during which time he observed the household with the careful attention of a man who understood that the lives of families often contained hidden complexities. He noted the unusual arrangement of the house, the way that certain areas seemed to be deliberately avoided by the family, the peculiar behavior of some of the servants when they thought they were not being observed. On his final evening at the plantation, as he was preparing to depart the next morning, Dr. Prescott asked Thomas Harrington a seemingly innocent question. He had noticed, he said, that the eastern wing of the house seemed to be unoccupied. Was there some reason that part of the house was not being used? Was there some structural problem that made it unsuitable for habitation? Thomas Harrington's response was immediate and emphatic. The eastern wing, he said, was perfectly suitable for habitation. It was simply that the family had no need for additional bedrooms at present. The rooms were maintained in good condition, and they were available should the family ever require them in the future. There was nothing unusual about the arrangement. Many large houses had rooms that were not in constant use. Dr. Prescott accepted this explanation, but he did not seem entirely satisfied by it. He asked a follow-up question. Had he perhaps heard voices coming from that part of the house during the night? He had been unable to sleep, he explained, and had been walking the corridors, and he thought he had heard someone moving about in the eastern wing. Thomas's face went very still. He said quietly that Dr. Prescott must have been mistaken. There was no one in the eastern wing. The sounds that he had heard were likely the house settling, or perhaps the wind moving through the corridors. Old houses made many sounds at night. It was easy to misinterpret them. That night, Eleanor called for the servants who attended to Margaret. She instructed them that Margaret was to remain absolutely silent from that moment forward. If Dr. Prescott heard any sound whatsoever coming from the eastern wing, the consequences would be severe, not just for Margaret, but for every servant in the house. Eleanor's voice, as she delivered these instructions, was cold and precise, and the servants understood that she meant exactly what she said. Dr. Prescott departed the next morning without further incident, but the episode had shaken something loose in the household. For the first time, the secret of Margaret's existence had come close to being exposed, and the family's response, the swift, decisive action taken by Eleanor, the fear that had rippled through the servants, suggested that the secret was worth protecting at almost any cost. As the years continued to pass, Margaret remained in her room. She was now in her 30s, and the world beyond the plantation had changed dramatically. The cotton economy had boomed, and with it the demand for enslaved labor had increased exponentially. The Harrington plantation had grown to nearly 2,000 acres, and the number of enslaved people working the land had increased to more than 300. The family's wealth had multiplied many times over. But Margaret's situation had not changed. She remained confined to her room, invisible to the world, acknowledged by no one, claimed by no one. The servants who had known her when she first arrived had grown old and had been sold or had died. New servants had come to the plantation, and they had been told the same story, that the eastern wing was not to be discussed,
that visitors were not to be shown that part of the house, that any servant who spoke of what they might have seen or heard there would face severe punishment. Some of the newer servants did not even know that Margaret existed. They simply understood that certain parts of the house were forbidden, and they did not question why. The mystery of the Eastern Wing became for them simply an accepted fact of life on the plantation, no more remarkable than the fact that the enslaved people were not permitted to learn to read, or that the family attended church every Sunday, while the people they enslaved were not permitted to attend services at all. William Harrington, Thomas's eldest son, had grown into a man and had taken over much of the management of the plantation. He had married a woman named Caroline, the daughter of a neighboring planter, and they had begun to have children of their own. William seemed to have inherited his father's capacity for not seeing what he did not wish to see. He never mentioned the Eastern Wing. He never asked about Margaret. He seemed to have accepted without question that certain parts of the family's life were simply not to be discussed. Catherine had married and moved away, settling in Charleston with a merchant's son. James had become involved in the militia and had developed a reputation as a man of strong opinions about the proper order of society. Susan and Robert had grown into adulthood and had begun to establish their own lives, though they remained closely connected to the plantation and to the family's interests. And yet, the question of Margaret's existence hung over the household like a cloud that no one acknowledged but everyone could feel. The servants knew, the family knew, and Margaret herself, of course, knew, but no one spoke of it. No one asked the questions that would naturally arise from the situation. Why was she there? How long would she remain? What would become of her? The silence surrounding Margaret had become so complete, so absolute, that it had taken on a kind of weight. It was as if the family had collectively decided, by refusing to acknowledge her existence, they could somehow make her cease to exist. But Margaret remained year after year, a living contradiction to this fiction. In 1835, a distant cousin of Eleanor's came to visit the plantation. Her name was Harriet, and she was a widow who had recently lost her husband and was traveling to visit various relatives in an attempt to distract herself from her grief. Harriet was a woman of considerable intelligence and even more considerable curiosity. She had read widely, traveled extensively, and had developed a habit of observing the world around her with a sharp and critical eye. During her stay at the plantation, Harriet noticed the same things that Dr. Prescott had noticed years before: the unusual arrangement of the house, the way that certain areas were avoided, the peculiar behavior of some of the servants when they thought they were not being observed. On her final evening at the plantation, as she was preparing to depart the next morning, Harriet asked Thomas a seemingly innocent question. She had noticed, she said, that the eastern wing of the house seemed to be unoccupied. Was there some reason that part of the house was not being used? Was there some structural problem that made it unsuitable for habitation? Thomas Harrington's response was immediate and emphatic. The eastern wing, he said, was perfectly suitable for habitation. It was simply that the family had no need for additional bedrooms at present. The rooms were maintained in good condition, and they were available should the family ever require them in the future. There was nothing unusual about the arrangement. Many large houses had rooms that were not in constant use. Dr. Prescott accepted this explanation, but he did not seem entirely satisfied by it. He asked a follow-up question. Had he perhaps heard voices coming from that part of the house during the night? He had been unable to sleep, he explained, and had been walking the corridors, and he thought he had heard someone moving about in the eastern wing. Thomas's face went very still. He said quietly that Dr. Prescott must have been mistaken. There was no one in the eastern wing. The sounds that he had heard were likely the house settling, or perhaps the wind moving through the corridors. Old houses made many sounds at night.
She noticed the peculiar silence that seemed to surround that part of the house. On her final evening at the plantation, Harriet asked to speak with Eleanor privately.
The two women sat in the parlor, and Harriet said, "I know that there is someone in the eastern wing. I do not know who, and I do not know why, but I want you to know that I have seen the signs, and I have understood what they mean." Eleonora's response was cold and measured. "What you have understood, Harriet, is that there are certain matters that are not appropriate for discussion. I trust that you will respect the privacy of this family and will not speak of what you think you have observed to anyone else. If you do, I can assure you that the consequences will be severe, not just for you, but for your reputation and for the reputation of your family as well." Harriet left the plantation the next morning. She did not speak of what she had discovered, not because she feared Eleonora's threats, but because she understood that to do so would be to expose a secret that once exposed could not be contained. Whatever was happening in the eastern wing of the Harrington plantation, it was a matter that the family had decided to keep hidden, and Harriet was not the kind of woman to deliberately cause such disruption. But she did write a letter to a close friend, a letter that was sealed and marked to be opened only after her death. In that letter, she described what she had observed at the Harrington plantation and expressed her conviction that there was a person, likely a woman, confined to the eastern wing of the house. She did not know the reason for this confinement, but she suspected that it had something to do with the family's honor or reputation. The letter was placed in a box with Harriet's other papers, and it was forgotten for the time being. As the 1830s progressed, the question of Margaret's status became increasingly complicated. She was now in her 40s, and she had spent nearly her entire adult life confined to a single room. She had never married. She had never had children. She had never experienced any of the things that a woman of her age might reasonably have expected to experience. But more importantly, her existence posed a legal and social problem that the Harrington family could not entirely ignore. Thomas Harrington was growing older, and his will would eventually need to be settled. The question of Margaret's status, was she a member of the family or not, would inevitably arise. Thomas had never formally acknowledged Margaret as his daughter. To do so would have been to admit to the existence of a relationship that had produced a child of mixed race, and such an admission would have been socially catastrophic. But neither had he entirely disowned her. He had brought her to the plantation, he had ensured that she was cared for, he had, in his own way, taken responsibility for her existence. The ambiguity of Margaret's status created a kind of legal limbo. She was not enslaved, the family had never claimed that she was, and to do so would have been to expose the secret of her existence to the broader community, but neither was she free in any meaningful sense. She could not leave the plantation without the family's permission. She could not own property. She could not enter into contracts. She could not marry. She existed in a state that had no legal name, in a category that the law did not recognize. This ambiguity became the subject of careful consideration by Thomas and Eleonora, and later by William, as the question of what would happen to Margaret after Thomas's death became increasingly pressing. If Margaret were to be freed upon Thomas's death, she would need to be acknowledged as his daughter, and the reason for her confinement would become public knowledge. If she were to remain confined, the family would need to ensure that whoever inherited the plantation would be willing to maintain the secret and continue to provide for her care. These were not questions that could be discussed openly. They were discussed in whispers, in private conversations, in letters that were carefully worded to avoid any explicit acknowledgement of what they were really discussing. But they were discussed, and the family understood that a decision would eventually need to be made. Thomas Harrington died in the winter of 1840, at the age of 62. He had been ill for several months, and his death, when it came, was not entirely unexpected. The family gathered at the plantation for the funeral, and the community mourned the passing of one of the most prominent men in the county. Thomas's will was read by the family's lawyer, a man named Samuel Whitfield, who had served the Harrington family for more than 30 years. The will was lengthy and detailed, as the wills of wealthy men tend to be. It divided the plantation among Thomas's legitimate children, William, Catherine, James, Susan, and Robert. It made bequests to various charitable institutions and to the church, but it made no mention of Margaret.
This silence was, in its own way, more eloquent than any explicit statement could have been. Thomas had chosen to not acknowledge Margaret in his will. He had chosen not to free her, not to provide for her, not to recognize her existence in any legal document. The implication was clear. Margaret was to remain in the Eastern Wing, and the family was to continue to maintain the fiction that she did not exist. But the will also contained a clause that was unusual and that would later prove to be of great significance. It stated that William Harrington, as the eldest son and the primary heir to the plantation, was to be the executor of the estate and was to have full authority over all matters related to the property and its management. This included, the will stated, all matters of a private or confidential nature that may have been entrusted to my care during my lifetime. This clause was vague enough to be interpreted in multiple ways, but it was clear enough to those who understood the situation to mean that William was to be responsible for maintaining the secret of Margaret's existence and for ensuring that she continued to be cared for. William accepted this responsibility without apparent hesitation. He was now the master of the Harrington plantation, and he seemed to understand that the maintenance of the family's reputation depended on the continued silence regarding Margaret. The 1840s and 1850s passed, and Margaret remained in her room. She was now in her 50s, and the world beyond the plantation had changed dramatically. The nation was moving towards civil war. The question of slavery had become the central political issue of the age. Abolitionists in the North were calling for the immediate end to slavery, while slaveholders in the South were defending the institution as necessary and even beneficial. The Harrington family, like most planter families, was deeply invested in the continuation of slavery. The family's wealth, the family's power, the family's entire way of life depended on the labor of enslaved people. William Harrington had become increasingly vocal in his defense of slavery, and he had taken on a leadership role in the local militia, which was being organized in preparation for the possibility of armed conflict. But even as William defended slavery as an institution, he continued to maintain the secret of Margaret's confinement. The contradiction between his public positions and his private actions was not something that he seemed to recognize or to be troubled by. Margaret was not enslaved, he would have said if anyone had asked. She was a member of the family, albeit a member whose existence was not to be publicly acknowledged. The fact that she was confined to a single room, that she was not permitted to leave the plantation, that she had no legal rights and no control over her own life, these things did not, in William's mind, constitute slavery. Margaret herself seemed to have accepted her fate with a kind of resignation that bordered on indifference. She was now an old woman, and the possibility of escape or of any significant change in her circumstances seemed to have passed long ago. She spent her days reading, writing letters that were never sent, and looking out of the window of her room at the world that she could see but never touch. The servants who attended to her had changed many times over the years. Some of them felt pity for her, others felt nothing at all, but all of them understood that they were to maintain absolute silence about her existence. The secret of the Eastern Wing had become so deeply embedded in the culture of the plantation that it seemed almost natural, almost inevitable that there should be a room that was never used, a person who was never acknowledged, a part of the family that was never mentioned. In 1858, a young man named Thomas Harrington, Jr., William's eldest son, came of age and began to take on more responsibilities in the management of the plantation. Thomas Jr. was intelligent, educated, and ambitious. He had been sent to a prestigious academy in Charleston and traveled to Philadelphia and New York. He had been exposed to ideas and perspectives that were not common in the low country of South Carolina. One day, while reviewing the household accounts, Thomas Jr. noticed something unusual.
The eastern wing of the house. Expenses for food, for candles, for firewood, for the repair and maintenance of the rooms. These expenses had been going on for decades, and they were substantial. Yet, as far as Thomas Jr. could tell, the eastern wing was not being used. He asked his father about these expenses. William's response was evasive. The rooms were being maintained, he said, in case they were ever needed. It was important to keep the house in good condition. The expenses were not significant in the context of the family's overall wealth. But Thomas Jr. was not satisfied with this answer. He pressed further. He asked to see the eastern wing. He said that if the rooms were being maintained, he should be familiar with them, as he would eventually be responsible for the management of the plantation. William refused. He said that the eastern wing was not suitable for visitors at present, and that Thomas Jr. should not concern himself with that part of the house. There were other matters that required his attention. This refusal only increased Thomas Jr.'s curiosity. He began to ask questions of the servants, carefully and indirectly, trying to understand what was happening in the eastern wing. Some of the servants refused to answer, others gave vague and contradictory responses, but gradually a picture began to emerge. There was someone in the eastern wing, someone who had been there for a very long time, someone whose existence was supposed to be kept secret. Thomas Jr. did not immediately confront his father with this information. Instead, he began to observe the household more carefully. He noticed the servants who seemed to have specific duties related to the eastern wing. He noticed the way that his father's expression changed whenever the eastern wing was mentioned. He noticed the peculiar silence that seemed to surround that part of the house. And then, one evening, he heard something. He was walking in the corridor near the eastern wing, and he heard the sound of a woman's voice singing softly. The song was old, and it was sung in a minor key, and it was filled with a kind of melancholy that seemed to speak of loss and longing. Thomas Jr. stood in the corridor and listened to the song until it faded away. And in that moment, he understood that there was indeed someone in the eastern wing, and that this person had been there for a very long time, and that the family had been keeping this person hidden from the world. The next morning, Thomas Jr. confronted his father. He asked directly and without any attempt to indirection who was in the eastern wing and why they were being kept hidden. William's response was to become very angry. He told Thomas Jr. that there were certain matters that were not appropriate for discussion, that the eastern wing was not his concern, and that he was to stop asking questions about it immediately. If he continued to press the matter, William said, there would be consequences. But Thomas Jr. was not intimidated by his father's anger. He was a man of the 19th century, educated and exposed to new ideas. He could not accept the idea that a person could be confined to a single room for decades without explanation or justification. He demanded to know the truth. And finally, after years of silence, William told him. Margaret was Thomas Jr.'s half-sister. She was the daughter of Thomas Jr.'s grandfather and a woman of mixed race. She had been brought to the plantation decades ago and had been confined to the eastern wing because her existence posed a threat to the family's reputation and social standing. She had been kept hidden because to acknowledge her would be to admit to the existence of a relationship that had produced a child of mixed race, and such an admission would have been socially catastrophic. Thomas Jr. listened to this explanation in silence. And when his father had finished, he asked a simple question. Is she free? William did not answer immediately. Finally, he said, she is not enslaved, if that is what you are asking, but neither is she free in any meaningful sense. She cannot leave the plantation without our permission, she cannot own property, she cannot marry. She exists in a state that has no legal name. Then she is a prisoner, Thomas Jr. said. She is a member of this family, William replied, and she is being cared for. That is all that matters. But Thomas Jr. did not accept this answer. He said that he wanted to meet Margaret, that he wanted to speak with her, that he wanted to understand her situation for himself. William refused. He said that such a meeting would be inappropriate, that it would only upset Margaret, and that it would serve no purpose. The situation was what it was, and it had been what it had been for decades. There was no point in changing it now. But Thomas Jr. was determined. He waited until his father was away from the house, and then he went to the eastern wing. He knocked on the door of Margaret's room, and when there was no response, he opened the door and entered. Margaret was sitting by the window, looking out at the gardens. She was an old woman now, in her 60s, and her hair had turned white.
Her face was lined, and her eyes had a quality of deep sadness that suggested a lifetime of disappointment and loss. When Thomas Jr. entered, she did not seem surprised. She turned to look at him, and she said, "You are William's son." "I am," Thomas Jr. replied, "and you are my half-sister." Margaret nodded slowly. "I am," she said, "though I have never been acknowledged as such." Thomas Jr. sat down in a chair near the window, and the two of them talked for hours. Margaret told him about her life, about her childhood in Virginia, about the death of her mother, about her arrival at the plantation, about the decades she had spent in this room. She spoke without bitterness, but with a kind of weary acceptance that suggested she had made peace with her situation long ago. Thomas Jr. asked her if she wanted to leave, if she wanted to be free. Margaret considered the question for a long time before answering. "I am 63 years old," she said finally. "I have no family outside of this house. I have no skills that would allow me to support myself. I have no connections in the world. If I were to leave, I would have nowhere to go and no way to survive. So no, I do not want to leave, but I would like to be acknowledged. I would like to be treated as a member of this family rather than as a secret that must be hidden." Thomas Jr. promised her that he would work to change the situation. He said that he would speak to his father, that he would convince him that Margaret should be acknowledged and treated with the respect that she deserved. But when he spoke to his father, William refused. He said that to acknowledge Margaret would be to expose the family to ridicule and scandal. The situation was what it was, and it could not be changed without destroying the family's reputation. Thomas Jr. was frustrated by his father's refusal, but he was not entirely surprised. He understood that his father was a man of his time, a man who had been shaped by the values and prejudices of the society in which he lived. To ask him to acknowledge Margaret would be to ask him to go against everything that he had been taught to believe about honor, reputation, and social standing. In 1861, the Civil War began. The Harrington Plantation, like all plantations in the South, was affected by the war. Young men from the family and from the surrounding community went off to fight. The plantation's resources were...
The enslaved people on the plantation began to escape, seeking freedom with the Union armies that were advancing through the South. William Harrington died in 1863, killed in a skirmish near Charleston. Thomas Jr. inherited the plantation, and with it the responsibility for maintaining the secret of Margaret's existence. But the war had changed everything. The social order that had made Margaret's confinement possible was collapsing. The institution of slavery, which had been the foundation of Southern society, was being destroyed. The values and beliefs that had seemed so absolute and so unchangeable were being questioned and challenged. In 1865, the Civil War ended. The South had been defeated, and slavery had been abolished. The Harrington Plantation, like all plantations in the South, was in ruins. The enslaved people who had worked the land were now free. The family's wealth had been decimated. The social order that had sustained the family's power and prestige had been destroyed. And yet, Margaret remained in the Eastern Wing. She was now in her 70s, and the world had changed so dramatically that the reasons for her confinement seemed almost incomprehensible. But the family's commitment to maintaining the secret of her existence remained unchanged. Thomas Jr., now the master of the plantation, faced a choice. He could acknowledge Margaret, could treat her as a member of the family, could give her the recognition that she had been denied for so long, or he could continue to maintain the fiction that she did not exist, could continue to confine her to her room, could continue to pretend that the secret of her existence was still worth protecting. In the end, Thomas Jr. chose to maintain the secret. He told himself that Margaret was old, that she was content in her room, that to expose her to the world at this late stage in her life would only cause her suffering. But the truth was more complicated.
The secret of Margaret's existence had become so deeply embedded in the family's identity, so much a part of the way that the family understood itself, that to expose it would be to expose something fundamental about the family's nature and values. Margaret died in 1872 at the age of 81. She had spent 51 years in the eastern wing of the Harrington Plantation, confined to a single room, hidden from the world, denied the recognition and acknowledgement that she deserved. When she died, the family faced a question: what should be done with her body? To give her a proper funeral would be to expose the secret of her existence. To bury her in the family cemetery would be to acknowledge her as a member of the family. To dispose of her body in secret would be to treat her as if she had never existed at all. In the end, the family chose a middle path. Margaret was buried in a small cemetery on the edge of the plantation, in a grave that was marked with a simple stone that bore only her name and the dates of her birth and death. No one was told about the burial. No one was invited to attend. The grave was left unmarked in the family's records, and the secret of Margaret's existence was maintained, even in death. After Margaret's death, the eastern wing fell into disuse. The room where she had spent so many years was closed up. The furniture was covered with sheets. The windows were shuttered. The room became, in effect, a tomb, a space that existed but was not acknowledged, a room that was never entered, a part of the house that was never discussed. It was not until 1912, 40 years after Margaret's death, that the secret of the eastern wing was finally exposed. By that time, Thomas Jr. had died, and the plantation had passed to his son, Thomas Harrington III. Thomas III had grown up hearing vague references to the eastern wing, but he had never been told the full story of Margaret's confinement. In 1912, a fire broke out in the main house, and in the process of fighting the fire and assessing the damage, workers discovered the sealed room in the eastern wing. They found the bed still made, with sheets that had never been slept upon. They found the wardrobe still containing clothing that had never been worn. They found the writing desk still empty of any papers or letters. And they found something else, a journal hidden in a loose board beneath the floorboards of the room. The journal had been written by Margaret, and it contained a detailed account of her life in the eastern wing, her thoughts and feelings, her hopes and disappointments, her slow acceptance of her fate. The journal was discovered by a worker named James, who brought it to Thomas Harrington III. Thomas III read the journal, and in doing so, he learned the full story of his half-grant's confinement. He learned about her life before the plantation, about her arrival, about the decades she had spent hidden away, about her conversations with Thomas Jr., about her slow decline into old age. Thomas III faced a choice. He could destroy the journal and maintain the family secret, or he could allow the truth to be known. In the end, he chose to allow the truth to be known. He gave the journal to a historian who was researching the history of the Low Country, and the story of Margaret's confinement was finally exposed to the world. The revelation of Margaret's confinement shocked the community and the nation. Here was a story that seemed to encapsulate everything that was wrong with the Old South, the hypocrisy, the cruelty, the willingness to deny the humanity of those who did not fit into the family's carefully constructed image of respectability. But the story also raised questions that could not be easily answered. Why had the family been willing to go to such extraordinary lengths to maintain the secret of Margaret's existence? What did it say about the values and beliefs of a society that would require such deception? How many other secrets like this one were hidden behind the closed doors of grand houses and respectable families? The eastern wing of the Harrington Plantation was eventually restored, and the room where Margaret had spent so many years was preserved as a kind of memorial to her. Visitors to the plantation could see the room, could see the bed that had never been slept in, could read the journal that Margaret had written, could try to understand in some small way what it had meant to be hidden away, to be denied recognition, to be treated as a secret rather than as a person. But the room itself remained in many ways a mystery. The silence that surrounded Margaret's confinement for so long has been broken, but the questions that the room raises have not been answered. They may never be answered, and perhaps that is the most terrifying thing of all. Not the secret itself, but the realization that such secrets were possible, that families were willing to go to such extraordinary lengths to maintain them, that a person could be hidden away in plain sight, acknowledged by no one, claimed by no one, treated as if she did not exist. The bed in the eastern wing was never used, but it was always there, a silent testimony to the capacity of human beings to deny reality, to maintain fictions in the face of overwhelming evidence, to prioritize reputation and social standing over the basic dignity and humanity of another person. And in that silence, in that empty bed, in that sealed room, there is a story that continues to haunt us, a story that asks us to consider what we might be willing to hide, what secrets we might be willing to keep, what truths we might be willing to deny in order to protect our own sense of